I'm Dan Buchanan. Here in Brighton, they call me Dan the History Guy. This series of videos is about farming in municipal Brighton, from early settlement to modern online farming. Farming was carried on for thousands of years by indigenous peoples in various forms. Wild rice was a very important natural resource that was harvested and used as a critical food staple. Rice Lake and many other smaller lakes in the region were seasonal gathering places for groups who harvested the rice and prepared their food supplies for the long winter. The big difference in their approach compared to European settlers was that the indigenous people shared the resources they found and were interested in maintaining the viability of the resources over long periods of time. When the first European settlers came to Upper Canada in the first years of the 1800s, they were confronted by massive forests. They struggled to locate their land and survive those first few months. They learned very quickly how to cut the trees and construct a modest log cabin where the family could find shelter and safety from the dark, threatening forest. Yes, the forest was the enemy, and it must be overcome. Every acre of cleared land was both a challenge and a blessing. Cutting trees and clearing an acre of land required massive amounts of labor, which was scarce and expensive. If you didn't have strong sons or other family with you, the money was needed to hire the labor. It was a slow process. An acre or two a year was excellent for a small farmer. But there was no question about which crop everyone wanted to plant. Wheat, of course. Seeds could be carried from your old home in sacks and pockets, then scattered over the freshly scratched soil, which was rich from millennia of fermenting foliage. Word spread quickly back to the old home that wheat would jump out of this virgin soil, and yields were greater than anything they had experienced before. As more settlers came, bees were organized to clear land on a grander scale, all for the single purpose of clearing more land and growing more wheat. They were in such a hurry to get rid of the trees that the smoke from the fires darkened the sky for miles around, acting as a beacon to guide new settlers to see where their neighbors might be found. The pundits call it wheat mining, and that is an accurate description. Never again would one single crop monopolize the land as did wheat in the first half of the 1800s. More settlers came. Between 1830 and 1840, the population of Upper Canada doubled, and the demand for lumber followed suit. Sawmills popped up on every creek that provided enough water power to turn a wheel. Farmers with land to clear sold the trees and set to work preparing the land, anticipating an even larger crop of wheat next year. According to the census in 1851, there were 19 sawmills operating in Brighton Township alone. Mostly small installations, just platforms built on a creek valley, close enough to dip a paddle wheel into the water and set the saw in motion. Hundreds of men were employed in lumbering, cutting the trees, dragging them to the sawmills, and drawing the lumber on teamster wagons to the wharfs on Presqu'île Bay. In the peak year of 1853, almost 6 million linear feet of lumber passed through the 4 active wharfs at Presqu'île Bay. Schooners were loaded to capacity and then sailed under the watchful beam of the Presqu'île Point Lighthouse out into Lake Ontario, intent on completing the last leg of this major export business at a busy port on the south shore of Lake Ontario. In the 1850s, the Brighton and Seymour Gravel Road was built from Harbour Street all the way north of Codrington to meet the road from Campbellford. This gravel road was a boon to farmers in the upper concessions, making access to the town and the harbour much easier. At the same time, the Grand Trunk Railway was built, shrinking their world. Markets for farm produce were now much closer to the point of production, and all families in the community benefited from schools, churches, and stores, which were now a relatively quick and comfortable train ride away. But there was danger lurking in the soil. After decades of wheat mining, the rich loam clay of Northumberland County began to suffer. yields of wheat crops dropped off noticeably. And even more damaging, later in the decade, wheat prices fell sharply as thousands of acres of new, fresh farmland was settled in western Ontario, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Manitoba. Very soon, farmers around Brighton could not rely on wheat alone for their livelihood, and they had to adjust. Wheat mining was over. The Civil War south of the border created demand for dairy products as well as beef and pork. The growing populations of Canadian towns and cities agreed wholeheartedly, voting with their pocketbooks at the larger and well-stocked butcher shops and general stores. These and other changes ushered in a completely different type of farming in this region. And the farmers got the message. They quickly changed from wheat to beef and dairy, in one of the most dramatic and fast changes in the landscape since the clearing of the land. Better fences went up, and herds of cattle could be seen grazing across the land. Within a decade, barns were built to accommodate dairy and beef cattle, and mouths were filled with hay to feed the growing number of animals that were now kept inside during the harsh Canadian winter. And yes, it's true, manure piles got a lot bigger as a result. Wheat crops made way for barley and buckwheat, and cheese factories popped up along concession roads, taking as much milk as all those new dairy herds could produce. Many important parts of the dairy industry that we enjoy today began at this time. Farmers gained a new respect for themselves as their family farms grew into agricultural enterprises. An attitude set in that farming was a very honorable profession and that farmers should be treated as well as any other professional. The imagery we see in the Belden County Atlas of 1878 demonstrates very clearly how the farmstead was now idolized in a similar way as the traditional English estate. Farmers took pride in the appearance of their buildings, animals, and fields. It was a great time to be a farmer. Cattle and horses were sometimes represented in slightly exaggerated form in the county atlas, but the underlying theme was a celebration of good breeding and animal husbandry that drove the industry forward. The application of practical scientific developments resulted in better food for the masses. It was all so good and proper. Farming with a philosophy. An English traveler passing through Brighton Township in 1872 commented that farms around Hilton are in an excellent state of cultivation. And Codrington is a thriving village and destined to grow, being in the center of an excellent agricultural country. He also mentioned the fine new grist mill built only a couple of years before at Newcomb's Mills, called Orland today. This establishment would serve the community as a busy grist mill for many decades to come, also providing a public space for folks to visit and exchange information as they waited for the grain to be ground and the chop loaded in their wagon. The mill was an important link in the information system of the time. Did you know that during the 1880s, hops was a very popular crop in this area? This building was a hops kiln south of Smithfield, operated by Willett Bettle and his son Harry. In 1880, the tariff on hops was removed, and farmers in this area rushed to take advantage of the lucrative crop which was used in the breweries of New York State. Unfortunately, the rush lasted only a decade. In 1890, the U.S. slapped the tariff back on after an election changed the party in power. Farming and politics have always been a bad mix, and nothing much has changed on that front.